In a quiet military kennel, a decorated canine named Shadow waits for a fate he doesn't understand. Euthanasia at dawn. Deemed too aggressive to rehome, his days of loyal service seem forgotten. But just as the paperwork is signed, the base doors open and a blind U.S. Marine enters, alone, steady, carrying only his cane and memories of war. He kneels by the trembling dog and whispers a single word. What happens next silences the entire room and changes every life inside. The concrete kennel was silent, except for the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the slow drip of a leaking pipe. In one corner, a German shepherd named Shadow lay curled on a thin blanket. His coat, once the glossy black and tan of a decorated service dog, now bore the muted sheen of long campaigns and harder days. A faint scar traced the line of his shoulder, a quiet badge of missions no one here could name. Outside, midnight rain tapped against corrugated metal, each drop echoing like distant footfalls. The storm seemed to remember him. Every clap of thunder a low reminder of helicopter blades and explosions half a world away. But inside the kennel, there were no orders to follow, no partners to protect. Only the sharp scent of disinfectant and the quiet finality of the schedule, pinned to the clipboard by his door. Tomorrow at dawn he was set to be put down. Shadow lifted his head at the sound of boots in the corridor. Two figures passed by with muted voices, carrying forms and keys. Their words barely reached him, but he caught the tone. Resignation, a tinge of regret. Aggressive, one whispered. No family can take him. The other only sighed. Paperwork rustled, a pen scratched, and the footsteps faded. He shifted on the thin blanket, muscles twitching as if chasing memories of open fields and missions long completed. His ears twitched at every crack of thunder, but no command followed. There was no good boy, no familiar voice to calm the restless beat of his heart, only silence and the cold knowledge carried in every soldier's bones that orders once written are rarely undone, yet something inside him refused the quiet ending. He stayed alert, eyes fixed on the darkened doorway as though waiting for a signal only he could sense. Outside, the storm thickened, and deep in the night a single thought pulsed in the air like static. This story isn't over. Dawn crept in as a pale smear of gray through the narrow kennel windows. The overnight team moved with quiet efficiency, checking locks, logging notes, but their voices carried an undercurrent that didn't match routine. Shadow's name surfaced again and again, low enough to keep from echoing down the corridor, yet sharp enough for even a restless dog to sense. Near the reception desk, Sergeant Hale thumbed through a thin file, its corners soft from too many hands. 3 failed adoption attempts, he murmured to the duty vet tech Jenna. Families returned him inside a week. They all said the same thing. Unpredictable, can't settle. Jenna leaned closer, lowering her voice. But he's never shown that here. He obeys every order from the handlers. Hale's brow furrowed. It's not simple obedience they're worried about. It's the missions. You know the rumors, she hesitated. Everyone had heard fragments. A covert deployment overseas. An ambush no one was supposed to talk about. A day when a single K-9 supposedly saved an entire unit. But the official report was sealed, and every retelling carried a different edge, some heroic, some haunted. From the back hallway, another handler passed by and caught the last words. Still talking about Shadow? He asked, half whisper, half sigh. Command says he can't be reclassified. Too much liability, too many scars inside and out. The group fell quiet as the metallic clank of a kennel door echoed faintly. Shadow had risen, pacing with slow, deliberate steps, ears tilted toward the muted conversation. Jenna watched him through the reinforced glass, something unsettled stirring behind her calm expression. No one said it aloud, but the thought hung heavy between them. Perhaps this wasn't just about behavior. Perhaps the dog knew more, had lived more than any of them were allowed to understand. The phone rang just after sunrise, slicing through the low murmur of the morning shift. Sergeant Hale grabbed the receiver, expecting a supply delivery or a routine call from headquarters. Instead, a calm male voice, steady but edged with urgency, filled the line. My name is Daniel Cross, the caller said. I'm a former Marine. I need to see the dog named Shadow. Today, before any decisions are made, Hale blinked at the request. Sir, Shadow isn't available for adoption. His case is complicated. I'm aware, Daniel replied. Please, I only need a few minutes with him. I'll sign whatever you require. Something in the man's tone, neither pleading nor demanding but anchored by quiet authority, made Hale hesitate. Are you a former handler? He asked. A pause hummed on the line. Not exactly, Daniel said softly. But I think he knows me. Within the hour, word spread through the facility. A blind veteran was on his way to meet the K9 scheduled for euthanasia. None of the staff had ever heard of Daniel Cross, and the fact that he was blind made the visit even stranger. By mid-morning, the kennel buzzed with subdued speculation. Who was this man who claimed a connection no record showed? What could he possibly want with a dog labeled too unpredictable to rehome? Shadow paced his enclosure, head low but ears sharply alert, as if he too had heard the news. Every now and then he stopped and stared at the door, muscles tense with a focus that felt almost electric. When the outer gate finally creaked open hours later, the staff found themselves watching not just for a visitor, but for answers none of them could yet name. Something about this meeting promised to rewrite everything they thought they knew. Long before the quiet kennel and clipped whispers, there had been heat, dust, and the roar of engines in a country torn by war. The memory lived inside Shadow's mind like a storm he could never shake. He had been part of a special reconnaissance unit, trained to detect explosives and hidden dangers long before human senses could react. The days were a blur of sun-scorched roads and tense patrols, each step a silent calculation between life and sudden chaos. Soldiers spoke in brief, coded bursts over the radio. The rest of the language was unspoken. Footsteps slowing, breaths held, the soft signal of a raised hand. Shadow understood it all. Moving like a shadow indeed, his body tuned to every tremor in the air. One mission stood apart from the rest. It began as a routine sweep through an abandoned village. The heat pressed down like a heavy hand, and the distant mountains shimmered in a pale haze. Then the ground itself seemed to change, carrying a scent only Shadow recognized. Metal, oil, danger. He froze, muscles locked, a deep growl rising from his chest. The handler crouched instantly, trusting the warning. Orders snapped over the comms, men fanning out, scanning the road. A half-buried pressure plate lay just ahead, wired to a hidden cache of explosives. Before the team could fully retreat, a secondary blast ripped through a side alley. Shadow lunged toward his handler, the world dissolving into a white-hot roar. Dust swallowed everything, sight, sound, even breath. When the smoke cleared, lives had been saved, but not without cost. Several soldiers were injured, one critically, and in the frantic evacuation that followed, amid radio static and falling debris, Shadow was separated from the Marine who had trusted him with every heartbeat. That day's chaos was written nowhere in the official reports, but it remained etched in muscle and memory. Even now, in the quiet kennel, the scent of rain and the sound of distant thunder could pull him back to that instant, a moment where duty and love had collided, and where something vital had been left unfinished. Night pressed in early, wrapping the military compound in a blanket of damp fog. Inside the kennel, the usual chorus of barking and clinking bowls had faded to uneasy quiet. Only the soft drip of a leaky pipe marked time, each splash echoing through the concrete corridor like a slow, steady metronome. Shadow lay with his head on his paws, but sleep refused to come. Every sound outside, wind brushing the chain-link fence, distant thunder rolling across the base, pulled him back to alertness. His ears twitched at even the faintest shift of air. The storm clouds overhead rumbled with a low growl that seemed to match the one buried deep in his chest. In the staff office nearby, the night watch spoke in half-whispers, their conversation muffled but tense. Paperwork shuffled, a kettle hissed, and occasionally a chair scraped against the floor. Though their words were too soft to reach him clearly, Shadow sensed the weight of decisions being made. His tail twitched once, then stilled, as though he could feel the gravity of his fate in every vibration of the concrete beneath him. Lightning flickered beyond the small window, briefly painting the walls with a cold white glow. For a heartbeat, the kennel seemed to vanish, and another landscape, sand, smoke, the memory of a desert road, flashed behind his eyes. The phantom scent of burning metal filled his nose, and a distant voice from years ago called a command he still longed to hear. The storm deepened. Somewhere in that heavy air something stirred, a quiet thread of expectation he couldn't name but wouldn't ignore. Shadow rose and padded to the door of his run, standing perfectly still, eyes fixed on the hallway as if waiting for a signal only he could sense. The night was far from over. The storm had eased into a steady drizzle by the time the outer gates creaked open. It was still well before dawn, the compound wrapped in a gray mist that softened every light. Sergeant Hale, clipboard under his arm, glanced at the security monitor and frowned. A lone figure moved through the haze, walking with deliberate, unhurried steps. The man's posture caught Hale's eye first. Tall, squared shoulders, the kind of stance that came from years of discipline. But it was the white cane sweeping lightly in front of him that held the sergeant's gaze. The visitor paused at the checkpoint, rain beating on his jacket, and lifted his chin with quiet confidence. "I'm Daniel Cross," he said evenly. "I called earlier about the dog named Shadow." The guard on duty blinked, thrown by the sight of a man traveling alone in the wet dark. "Yes, sir. We've been expecting you," he replied, though the words sounded almost uncertain. Inside the kennel hallway, lights flicked on as staff stirred from their break room. Daniel's footsteps echoed softly on the polished floor. Steady, measured, each tap of his cane a calm heartbeat in the quiet building. Yet he moved with uncanny precision, rarely letting the cane linger, as if he already knew the path by memory. When the group reached Shadow's enclosure, the German shepherd was already on his feet, ears pricked forward. He neither barked nor growled. Instead, he let out a low, throaty whine that vibrated through the metal bars. The sound of recognition buried deep and sudden. Daniel stopped just outside the gate, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe. Though his eyes were clouded and unseeing, he turned his face directly toward the dog. "Easy, boy," he said softly, the faintest tremor of emotion threading his voice. The kennel seemed to hold its breath. Even the rain against the windows fell quieter, as if the night itself leaned closer to listen. Daniel stood motionless for a long beat, his clouded eyes fixed as though he could see through the darkness of Shadow's run. The German shepherd stayed equally still, head tilted, the low whine deepening into something almost like a soft cry. Sergeant Hale unlatched the gate with slow caution. "Sir, we can bring him out on a lead," he offered, but Daniel lifted one hand slightly, a quiet signal to wait. "Open the door," Daniel said. His voice carried a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. The latch clicked, and the door swung inward with a soft metallic sigh. Shadow stepped forward without hesitation. The usual stiffness he showed with strangers was gone. His paws barely made a sound on the concrete as he closed the distance, stopping inches from the man's boots. Daniel crouched, setting the white cane carefully aside. He extended his hand, palm open, the way soldiers greet a trusted partner. Shadow lowered his massive head until his muzzle rested against that hand, breathing in deeply as though confirming an old memory. The kennel staff exchanged uneasy glances. This was the dog who snarled at would-be adopters, who bristled even at seasoned handlers. Yet now he stood perfectly calm, eyes half closed, leaning gently into Daniel's touch. "Good boy," Daniel murmured, barely above a whisper. The words carried something heavier than affection, a tone of recognition, of homecoming. Shadow's tail gave a single slow wag. He inched closer, resting his weight against the Marine's knee, a silent pledge of trust. No one in the room spoke. The air felt thick with something unspoken, as if both man and dog had stepped into a private world of shared memory. The mystery deepened, leaving every witness with a single unshakable question. How could two souls who'd never met behave like long-lost partners reunited? The quiet in the kennel stretched until every drip from the leaking pipe felt like a clock tick. Sergeant Hale cleared his throat first, breaking the spell. "Mr. Cross," he said carefully, "I have to ask, have you met Shadow before? There's nothing in his file about you." Daniel's hand stayed on the dog's neck, fingers buried in thick fur. "No," he said softly. "Not in the way you mean." Jenna, the vet tech, exchanged a puzzled glance with Hale. "Then how—" she began, but her words trailed off as Shadow pressed even closer to Daniel's side, eyes closing with a trust that seemed impossibly earned in mere minutes. Hale shifted his weight, uneasy. "This dog has turned away every potential adopter. Even our senior handlers keep their distance. But with you," he gestured helplessly toward the calm German shepherd, "it's like he's found his person overnight." Daniel gave a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sometimes you don't need sight to recognize someone," he said. The staff hesitated, sensing the edge of a story but unable to step inside it. "Sir," Hale continued, voice lower, "Shadow's scheduled for euthanasia at dawn." Regulations don't allow exceptions without clear justification. If there's something we need to know, this is the time. Daniel's expression tightened, but he kept his gaze steady, unseeing yet resolute. "I'm asking for a private moment," he said at last. "Just a few minutes, then I'll explain everything." The kennel fell silent again. Rain pattered against the high windows, a soft counterpoint to the tension building in the room. Finally, Hale exhaled and nodded. "5 minutes," he said. "We'll give you 5. Daniel inclined his head in quiet gratitude, never removing his hand from Shadow's warm coat. Behind the stillness, something unspoken seemed to gather like a storm about to break. The kennel door clicked shut, leaving Daniel and Shadow in a hushed half-light. The rain outside softened to a distant murmur, like static on a forgotten radio. Daniel stayed kneeling, one hand resting on Shadow's strong neck, the other tracing the jagged scar along his muzzle as though reading a secret written in raised fur. "You remember the desert, don't you, boy?" Daniel whispered. The words were not for human ears. The smell of diesel and hot sand, the sound of rotors cutting the sky. Shadow let out a low, almost mournful whine. His ears flicked, eyes fixed on a place far beyond the kennel wall. Daniel's mind drifted backward, to a day burned into memory. He pictured a dusty street in a nameless village, buildings crumbling under a pitiless sun. He and his canine partner had moved as one. Every signal, every breath shared. They'd been searching for an IED rumored to be hidden along a supply route. Then the world exploded. A pressure wave, a wall of sound, then darkness. Daniel woke days later in a field hospital with bandaged eyes and the fractured news that his dog was gone. No body recovered, presumed dead, but he never felt that loss settle as truth. In dreams, he'd still hear the sharp bark of warning, the scrape of paws on gravel, the quiet huff of breath beside his cot. Something in his chest had always insisted the bond wasn't broken. Now, kneeling on cool concrete, he let the memories spill like quiet confession. "I thought I lost you that day," he said, voice trembling. "They told me you didn't make it, but I kept hearing you in my sleep, your signal, your call. I knew, somehow. You were still out there." Shadow pressed his head firmly against Daniel's chest, a silent, powerful acknowledgement. In the dim kennel, past and present finally overlapped, two halves of a story that had refused to end. The quiet deepened until even the rain seemed to pause outside. Daniel steadied his breathing, one hand still on Shadow's neck, the other finding the dog's chest where the heartbeat thudded in perfect rhythm with his own. He lowered his head and spoke barely above a breath. "Sentinel," he whispered. The change was immediate and electric. Shadow's ears snapped upright, body tensing like a drawn bow. His tail lifted, wagging in a slow, purposeful arc. He stepped back, then sat sharply at attention, spine straight, eyes blazing with alertness. It was the precise motion of a trained military canine responding to an elite command. Behind the glass, Sergeant Hale and Jenna gasped. No one had told them of such a command. No file mentioned it, no handler briefed it. Yet the obedience was flawless, automatic, a living password to a past they hadn't imagined. Daniel raised his voice a fraction, still calm but carrying the unmistakable cadence of a soldier giving orders. "Stand guard." Shadow pivoted, scanning the room with razor focus. Every muscle tightened, his breathing even and ready. Then he returned to Daniel's side, chest high, waiting for the next command that only one man on Earth seemed to know. The staff exchanged bewildered looks. That's advanced combat training," Jenna whispered, awed. "He responds like he never stopped working." Daniel finally turned his sightless eyes toward the window where the others stood frozen. "This isn't coincidence," he said quietly. "This is recognition." Shadow let out a low, satisfied huff and nudged Daniel's hand, the way he once had after a successful mission. The room felt charged, as though an invisible line had been reconnected after years of silence. In that moment, every unanswered question, every rumor, every mystery tightened into a single truth waiting to be spoken. The word had unlocked it, and no one present would ever forget the instant when a forgotten soldier and his long-lost partner found each other again. The door swung open and Sergeant Hale stepped back inside, his boots scuffing the concrete. Jenna followed, eyes wide, still processing the flawless obedience they had just witnessed. Daniel remained kneeling, his hand resting on Shadow's shoulder, the dog calm but alert, tail sweeping the floor in slow, deliberate arcs. "You need to explain this," Hale said, voice low but unyielding. How does a dog labeled unpredictable respond like he's still on active duty? And what did you just call him? Daniel drew a steady breath. Sentinel, he answered. That was his real call sign in the field. The name hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I was his handler, Daniel continued, his voice soft but clear. 3 years ago in Kandahar, we were deployed together for over a year. Every mission, every night patrol. He saved my unit more times than I can count. His fingers tightened slightly in the dog's fur. On our last mission, we were ambushed. The explosion blinded me. I was told Sentinel was killed in the blast. Jenna covered her mouth, stunned. But if this is true, how did he end up here? Daniel shook his head. Somehow in the chaos, we were separated. Paperwork can get lost when everything burns. Someone must have found him wandering and logged him as an unidentified K9. New name, new file. To the system, he was just another unclaimed dog. Hale flipped through Shadow's thin folder, each page suddenly inadequate. The pieces clicked into place. His unshakable discipline, the unexplained scars, the whispers of a classified mission. Daniel's voice softened, thick with emotion. I never stopped believing he was alive. Every night I heard him in my dreams. And today, he heard me. Shadow pressed closer, resting his head firmly against Daniel's chest as if confirming every word. The kennel, once a place of endings, now felt like a room where a miracle had quietly unfolded. Sergeant Hale's hands trembled slightly as he set the thin folder aside. Call sign or not, he said carefully. I need more than words. Regulations require proof before I can stop what's scheduled for this morning. Daniel nodded, calm but resolute. Then watch, he said. He gave a soft command one few outside elite military units would recognize. Perimeter sweep. Instantly, Shadow leapt to his feet, his posture transforming from calm companion to precision-trained soldier. He trotted the length of the kennel, nose low, scanning corners with sharp, practiced movements. At each turn he stopped, glanced back at Daniel, and continued the circuit until the entire room had been inspected. Return, Daniel said. Shadow came straight back, sitting neatly at his handler's side, tail still, eyes locked forward. Jenna's jaw dropped. That's advanced reconnaissance training, she whispered. We don't even teach that here. Daniel reached for the next test. Stand guard. Shadow immediately pivoted, planting himself between Daniel and the doorway. His ears flicked toward every small sound in the hallway. A faint footstep outside made him tense, a low rumble vibrating in his chest until the noise faded. Then just as quickly he relaxed and resumed his watchful stance. The room fell silent except for the soft rhythm of the dog's breathing. Hale finally exhaled. There's no question, he said, his voice quieter now. He's not just trained, he's bonded. This is a working military dog following commands only his original handler could give. Shadow eased back to Daniel's side and pressed his head against the Marine's knee, as if punctuating the demonstration with one last undeniable fact. Their partnership had never been broken. Proof didn't lie in papers. It lived in the seamless dance between man and dog that no years apart could erase. The kennel office, once heavy with resignation, now pulsed with a quiet urgency. Sergeant Hale stepped back from the enclosure and drew a long breath. This changes everything, he said, his voice steady but charged. He turned to Jenna. Get me command, now. Jenna hurried to the desk phone, fingers trembling slightly as she dialed. Moments later, the base commander's groggy voice crackled through the speaker. Hale straightened, choosing his words carefully. Sir, we have an immediate development regarding K9 Unit Shadow. This dog is not what his records indicate. We have confirmation, visual demonstration, that he is Sentinel, a decorated military working dog presumed lost in action 3 years ago. His original handler, Sergeant Daniel Cross, is here. A pause, heavy with disbelief, filled the line. Are you certain? The commander finally asked. Beyond doubt, Hale replied. We witnessed specialized commands executed flawlessly. The bond is undeniable. Static buzzed for a heartbeat, then the commander's tone hardened with sudden clarity. Cease all euthanasia procedures immediately. I'm issuing an emergency stay and reclassification order. Transfer full custody to Sergeant Cross after proper verification. Relief swept the room like a sudden gust of fresh air. Jenna exhaled audibly. Understood, sir, Hale said, his voice softening. Thank you. When the line clicked dead, Hale turned to Daniel. The order's canceled. He's yours, officially. Daniel's jaw tightened, emotion flickering behind his sightless eyes. He knelt and pressed his forehead to Shadow's, a silent reunion years in the making. The German Shepherd let out a soft whine, tail sweeping the floor in slow, grateful arcs. In the corner, the folder that once sealed Shadow's fate lay forgotten, its grim paperwork meaningless. For the first time in months, the kennel felt alive with something stronger than duty. A rescue born not of chance, but of a bond no distance or time could break. 2 weeks later, morning sunlight spilled across a quiet suburban porch where Daniel stood with a steaming mug of coffee. Beside him sat Shadow, no longer a number in a file but a family member with his true name restored. The German Shepherd rested calmly yet alert, his eyes scanning every flutter of leaves in passing car, still the vigilant sentinel who once guarded soldiers in distant deserts. Life had changed in small but profound ways. Inside the house, everything from the couch cushions to the kitchen rug now bore faint paw prints, signs of a presence that filled the space with warmth and purpose. Neighbors who once walked past without notice now paused to greet the decorated K9, offering treats and heartfelt thanks after reading the story that had spread through local papers and veteran networks. Daniel's days found a new rhythm. Each morning began with long walks through the neighborhood park, Shadow matching his steady pace and guiding him around obstacles with almost uncanny intuition. When strangers asked if he was a service dog, Daniel would smile and say, "He's more than that, he's family, and he's a hero." Together they began volunteering at veteran rehabilitation centers. Shadow's calm strength comforted wounded soldiers and those battling invisible scars of war. He would rest his head gently on a trembling knee, or sit patiently beside someone lost in memory, offering silent companionship that words could never match. On quiet evenings, Daniel often sat on the porch with a soft hand resting on Shadow's back, feeling the slow, reassuring rise and fall of his breath. The bond forged in combat had survived separation, bureaucracy, and the threat of death, only to return stronger. Where once there had been loss and unfinished duty, now there was healing, a life rebuilt on trust, loyalty, and a love that never faded, even in darkness. As twilight settled over the quiet neighborhood, Daniel leaned back in his porch chair, the soft evening air filled with the rhythmic chirp of crickets. Beside him, Shadow lay stretched across the wooden planks, head on his paws, eyes half closed but always aware. A soft breeze carried the faint scent of rain, and for the first time in years Daniel felt a deep, unshakable peace. He thought of the night he'd lost his sight, the explosion, the chaos, the crushing belief that his closest partner had been taken from him forever. For years he'd carried that wound, invisible but heavy, believing that chapter of his life was closed, and yet somehow fate had turned what seemed like a tragic ending into a quiet miracle. "Some bonds," he whispered, reaching down to stroke the dog's thick fur, "can survive anything." Shadow answered with a gentle sigh, leaning closer until Daniel could feel the warmth of his breath. News of their reunion had spread far beyond the base. Letters from veterans arrived daily, many sharing their own stories of service dogs who'd changed or even saved their lives. Messages poured in from families, school children, and animal lovers moved by the idea that courage and loyalty could outlast war, paperwork, and even death itself. Daniel decided to turn that momentum into action. He began speaking at community events and veteran centers, advocating for better retirement programs for military K9s, and for support services pairing them with soldiers who needed healing. Shadow often accompanied him, sitting proudly at his side like the living proof of his message. As night deepened, Daniel felt Shadow's tail give a slow, contented thump against the floorboards. "We made it home, buddy," he said softly. If this story touched your heart, share it so others remember that no act of devotion is ever lost. Like and subscribe to help bring attention to K9 veterans and the heroes who stand beside them. Because sometimes, as Shadow and Daniel proved, one quiet word spoken at the right moment can rewrite an entire life.